Hello everyone, and welcome back to Amaranth Bay. Last episode, which basically came out just a couple days ago, we built the downtown core, most of which you can see to the left of the freeway here. Today we're going to be turning our attention to the north end of downtown, where we're going to make a more modern section dedicated to the city's up-and-coming medical sector. Last time I made a hospital in Cities Skylines, it was kind of a more sprawling, modern campus, but with this one I wanted to fit it into the pre-existing infrastructure of downtown, meaning that we're going to largely leave the downtown grid intact and work around that, although I did give myself a little leeway here getting rid of this one uphill street so that we can have a nice, large set of buildings right here at the center of the hospital. I'm going to go ahead and level out all these horizontal roads so that we only have slope going in one direction, which is going to make it a lot easier to detail later on, and we still get that nice gentle slope going upward, which is going to create lots of opportunities for interesting detailing. The main building at Duluth's hospital is kind of an interesting glass tower, and I knew I had absolutely no chance of replicating this in-game. So I'm going to try using a different style of asset and just go for the same general feeling, the same sort of silhouette. I'm not just going to keep the asset as is. Later on, we're going to make a bunch of changes and additions with PO that's going to make it sort of more into its own unique looking building. But first, I wanted to figure out what the hospital, or at least this main part of the hospital, is going to look like at ground level. In Duluth, they have a warmer colored brick structure near the bottom. Just, I assume, to make it a little bit more pleasing to walk by at street level. So I'm going to try to do that by using this high school asset and manipulating it with PO until I get something that conforms with the space we have available. One interesting feature of this building is that obviously it spans this central road that runs between these two blocks, so I'm gonna have to punch a hole through the base of this building, just bring parts of it up with PO and then over to the side. To cover up this area here, I thought I'd try a few different things, and what I settled on, funnily enough, is just pure concrete. I'm almost kind of using it as an accent color here, which at first I thought like, oh, that's not gonna work, but I think it actually looks kind of nice in a weird way, which I normally wouldn't say about plain concrete. But in this instance, I guess I am. So this asset that I chose has a helipad on top in the structure that's attached to it, which I didn't really want in that spot, but at this point, for whatever reason, maybe I was just being lazy, I didn't feel like messing around with that too much in PO. So I decided to build the central tower portion right in the center, unlike the one in Duluth, which is kind of over to one side, as you saw in the reference shot before. But I think it just ends up looking kind of bad, a little bit phallic maybe, but I just couldn't bring myself to do something out of the ordinary or more interesting than this. So I decided just to leave this for now and move on to the other sections of the hospital so we can put the kind of basic structure down for those, and then we'll come back to this later, do something more interesting that is going to fit into the surroundings better than what we have right now. One thing that I gathered from poking around the hospital on Google Maps is that there have been a number of expansions and remodels over the years, obviously with the main tower that we just started putting together being the most recent. The second most recent is going to be this stretch of buildings to the left of it. I wanted this one to look somewhat plain compared to both the new one that we just made and the older ones that we're going to add later on. So I'm using this set of generic office buildings and arranging them in a way that you get this kind of almost like chunky looking structure, which I think is pretty typical of this kind of hospital and looks more interesting than just a boring rectangle. Of course, I still want it to look boring, but boring with just a little hint of interesting structure here and there. Now, the spot connecting the newest building to this older one is going to be kind of in between. So we have this relatively plain facade, except it's going to be curved for a couple reasons. First, to mirror just the gentle curvature of the main new tower, and also so it can fit in the main drop-off area for this part of the hospital. I thought a little bit of overlap between the newer and older side would be good here, and there is a little bit of that in the Duluth hospital, so I wanted to do something along those lines by having this glass section run along on top of the curved section. And I don't actually know what the circumstances of this part of the Duluth hospital were, but to me it basically screams expansion. Like they had this original curved part of the building, and then they literally just added a few floors above it in a slightly different style. And I think that kind of contrast almost in a weird way helps bring everything together, as opposed to having these two totally different styles of building right next to each other with no overlap whatsoever. I found that managing the way the buildings are lined up, these disparate styles of buildings are lined up, is probably even more important than choosing the particular style of building or being consistent with that. Like if you have these kind of random rectangles meeting and then there's like just this tiny little bit of space in between them, or if they intersect with windows in ways that don't make any sense, if you have enough of those little defects, it kind of adds up and your brain just tells you, no, this is just random stuff smashed together. So I was trying to be careful to make sure everything lined up. Some of this is going to be altered and taken care of in the detailing section of the video, but I tried to be mindful of how these different buildings intersect and trying to make them look like they could actually be buildings that are connected to each other, like you could access one building from the other from the inside. Out around back of the chunky building, I wanted to add a parking platform, which is it's there in Duluth, so I wanted to do it for that reason, but also it's just a pretty handy way to cover up the steep slope right here next to the road. Across Main Street, I wanted to add another extension that's maybe contemporary or a little bit older than the chunky building that we just built. So I settled on using this extremely plain-looking building, which was basically exactly the kind of institutional-looking asset that I was looking for. I did think that this entire block was a bit too big to fill in with just this, and I didn't want to have too much variation, so I decided to break my own rule and adjust the road network just a little bit. So I'm splitting this part of the block in half, just with this placeholder road, and we're going to add a curved section to it in just a second. I'm going to justify this, I think, in a later episode where we're going to have the freeway shift over at this point, and that curve is kind of going to be up against the part where the freeway moves over closer to the downtown. That's a topic for another day. Just know that that's going to make sense in the context of the other parts of the city, and it's not just something I'm going to do and kind of have it be this weird little oddity in the hospital. On the other side of the hospital, we're going to have a mostly uninteresting block, which consists of this pre-made hospital asset, which I actually quite like and I think is going to fit into the context nicely once we detail it up. And this is where the ambulances and the helicopters are going to originate from. Obviously, we have this nice helipad on top, and there's also a giant parking garage and a surface parking lot right next to it, because why not? My understanding is that this was the first building in the medical center in Duluth, or at least the original location. I looked through the workshop for probably a good 2 or 3 hours trying to find an asset that looked like this, but I couldn't find anything that really worked on its own. So I had to go back to the sort of kit bashing that I was doing for the main hospital building. I wanted to avoid that because I think it's harder to do that with brick buildings successfully, because you have to make sure that the texture and color of the brick from different assets mesh together and work together, and that's just really hard to do. In the end, I did end up choosing 3 really high quality assets and just subtly and carefully adjusting the color on them to try to get them to match in different lighting conditions. And if you don't think what I have right now looks good, don't worry, I do a lot of adjustments off camera later on to get them to match even better. I thought it was a cool feature in the reference building that there's this small and really obviously modern addition to the front. So I wanted to add something like that, just using this generic office pack to add this little rectangular extension. One bonus of doing this is that it hides the mismatch between the bricks of the 3 unique assets that I used, at least down at the bottom. And I think with just this little bit of brick exposed at the top in this middle section, it's a lot harder to tell how different the tones of the different bricks are, because you just don't have as much of a reference point for the middle section. Around back, there's going to be an alley that's been converted into an access road for this part of the hospital, and then we're going to have another mixture of new and old here. There's this massive brick chimney around the back of the building, which I couldn't find any direct information on across the entire internet, but as best I can tell, some hospitals around this time would have their own steam heating plants, a lot like the Canal Park one that we built a few episodes back. I have to imagine that the real life one isn't operational anymore, just because I couldn't find any information about it. but I wanted ours to be functional. So later on, when we go through the detailing phase, I'm going to try to bring it to life and give it some purpose. For now though, I'm just going to plop it down. We have this little utility building next to it that would have been part of the original heating plant, along with more boring modern extensions using the same office pack that I used before. Before I can say that we're finally done putting down all the main structures of the hospital, we have to go back and change the centerpiece. And I think I'm just going to stick with this. No, what I'm going to do is merge all the nodes of the rectangular base together, just so we can isolate this rounded part around top, and then use that as the base. So that's going to give this thing a much more interesting shape overall, I think. Then I'm going to drag every single node around back to line up with what I've already built, because I'm lazy and I don't want to have to redo all that to match up with the curved part. So we're just going to flatten that out, make it a lot easier. And now since the front is curved, I have to go back and adjust all the base pieces so that their angle mirrors the curve of the building above. And that just looks better than having this ugly blocky base. And then obviously I have to punch a hole through where the road goes again, except that doesn't work for some reason with this asset, maybe because of the way I got rid of the base, I don't know. Anyway, I realized that instead of doing that, I have to make another copy of the building, lower it down, raise the first one up, and then just basically cut it in half. And that's going to end up creating our tunnel, and I think that looks fine. I'm just going to go ahead and cover up all those ugly bits, again, off camera with the same stuff I did before, including this gorgeous concrete. Finally, to get something that looks a bit more like the Duluth Hospital, I'm going to take another copy of the building with the curved part isolated, raise it up, and shrink it down so that it can stand on its own as the main tower. And now because I've gotten rid of the helipad and the structure that's attached to it, I can have it off to the side. I don't have to have it in the center to cover things up. I didn't think the different scales of the glass looked good between the tower and the base, so instead of trying to make them line up, which I think would have been probably possible but very difficult and annoying, I decided just to make a completely intentional architectural feature and have this tiered glass setup, which I think looks better than having kind of this mismatched glass texture. And now we are actually done putting down all the main structures of the hospital. Except for this parking garage, and that parking garage, and that parking lot. I wanted to have a few different entrances dotted around the base of this main part of the hospital, just to spread out traffic a little bit and also make the building more accessible overall. So there are two over here near the frontage road next to the freeway. I started using this stone wall network to make some planters, thinking that this was kind of a theme that I could take throughout the whole build, or at least the modern parts of the building. Thinking that even though it is a modern addition, they're kind of trying to use designs and the sorts of materials that would have been used in the downtown since the very beginning. So these stone walls could evoke old stone foundations or retaining walls or that sort of thing. Although, now that I'm looking at it, I wonder if I maybe should have just gone with brick instead, but it's a bit too late for that. There already happened to be a bus stop over here, which I wanted to add anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and keep that and add a little modern bus shelter next to it. To go along with the idea that this is a recent addition, I only used younger trees and some sparse tufts of grass and spaced them out quite a bit imagining that they would want to leave room for them to grow up into mature trees. I do like how the trees end up looking, but I'm not so sure about the grass. I think it looks a little bit scraggly and kind of randomly spaced. So maybe I'll go back and change that at some point, but I'm not sure. I didn't want this little area between the base and the tower to go to waste, so I'm going to go ahead and add a staircase down to it from this platform up here, which is very soon going to become the main entrance to the hospital. And then to cover up this mess here, I'm going to add a sloped planter next to it. Over on the far end, I added an entrance using a couple of these very simple door props. I wasn't sure about the darker concrete next to the lighter one on this piece that spans Main Street, but I actually think it ends up looking not too bad, and anytime I can spare myself from having to go into the texture in PO and add a color rectangle to change the color, whether it's lightening it or darkening it or whatever, I'm going to take that opportunity to not do that, so I'm just going to leave it as is, and I think it looks good enough. Because this is just a side entrance, I didn't want to overload it with details, so I'm just going to put down a few benches and these really simple light props, which I like a lot, especially this cone of light that they cast down beneath them. I think that looks really nice. There's a very cool looking sky bridge that connects to the curved area we were building earlier, where the bridge follows along with the curve of the building beneath this. So I knew I had to replicate this or build something kind of like it. So to do this, I had to use a network, of course, to be able to curve it, but I didn't really have one that was an enclosed pedestrian path, and I don't even know if there's anything like that on the workshop. So we're just going to build it from scratch using this Adaptive Networks pedestrian path. I'm going to add a red roof, which I think looks really nice, thinking that it sort of like fits into the medical theme a little bit, but it does contrast quite a bit with the built-in green textures on the railing and the bottom of the deck. So I think it looks good from above, but the colors kind of clash and look not intentional from street level. So off camera, I ended up changing the roof over to green, which just looks more cohesive, and it also fits in with the ones we've done in the other parts of the city as well, which have green roofs. To fix the problem of it being open air, which is probably not a good idea in a place that gets freezing cold winters, I used IMT to add some glass props along the edges, just like the same way we did it with the sky bridges in the convention center. On this side of the tower, with the completely intentional tiered glass structure, is going to be the main pedestrian-focused entrance. Due to the way I've stretched this asset out, though, it looks kind of weird and very plain, so I'm going to take a glass skyscraper, same one we used for the other part of the glass expansion over there to the left, and clip that into it, just taking advantage of these stripes that are built into the asset that jut out just a little bit. And that way it can give the impression that there are different floors here, and we can actually have some nice windows, which just feels a little bit more fitting for this main side of the hospital. The curved glass bit is going to serve as the actual entrance part of the main entrance, with multiple doors around the base to access the lobby, which is going to consist of the curved glass. I imagine it would be a pretty nice spot on the inside with all these windows letting in natural light, but unfortunately we don't get to see any of that, so we'll just have to make do with some door props and some more planters. I'm just going to go ahead and magic up the rest of these so that I don't subject you to too much of the same thing over and over again. And just to tie everything together, I feel like the glass needs just something a bit more, a splash of color, to make it stand out as being the main entrance. So I'm going to go ahead and add this circular red awning, or whatever the term is. So it's clearly a herringbone pattern brick surface, but just pretend that those are like shingles or something like that. I just wanted to go with that red color. At the time, I was thinking it would match up with the pedestrian overpasses, but obviously I ended up changing those. But I still think the red serves as a nice little splash of color just to highlight that it's the entrance. To try to actually get some people to visit this area, I'm going to, first of all, lay down just a simple pedestrian network that reflects the various pathways that we built, and then I'm going to clip a couple of commercial buildings into the main entrance, hoping that that will get people to use this pedestrian area. And of course, it's accurate for people to show up to a hospital and spend boatloads of money. After quickly putting together an accessible parking lot, I'm going to detail up the car-focused drop-off area. The curved building had this kind of bright orange wall built in on the side, which really stood out to me. So I thought I'd take advantage of that idea and transform it a bit into more of a focal point in between the two entrances. I didn't have any purpose-made art in my collection other than these big kind of ad posters, which happen to have some nice art on them. So I took this one, sized it up, and lowered it down so you can just see the art portion of it. So with that more unique part out of the way, a lot of the details here along the entrance are pretty similar to what we've already done. So I think I'm just going to quickly knock them out with a bit of music. In the end, I wasn't 100% satisfied with the way the facade of the curved building fits in with the rest of the structures, especially since I couldn't quite get the color to match the chunky building to the left that it's meant to be a part of, but I think it's good enough to move on and forget about it for a while we detail up Mr. Chunky, which I'm going to turn into the emergency room entrance. To try to get some different types of traffic coming and going from this entrance, I'm going to clip in a hospital block so we can get some ambulances driving up and away, and also a commercial block so we can get people coming and going. The front is pretty sparse on details with just a bright sign up above the entrance so you know where to go. And I also wanted to connect this whole area up to the other entrances via this small pedestrian path and the usual types of planters. So I wanted to imagine that you could walk all along here through the hospital grounds instead of going along the sidewalk if you wanted to for whatever reason to get from one building to another when it's nice out or something like that. I did add a different style of planter out front, so it has brick retaining walls, a different color of gravel fill, and overall slightly more mature foliage, just to show that this has been around for longer than the other parts of the hospital we've made so far. Around back, we already have the structure of the parking platform ready to go, so I just need to put down a bunch of parking spaces and a little bit of pavement as a buffer between the lot and the buildings. Most of the deck won't work for the functional parking assets that I would usually use in this kind of situation, so I'm just going to go ahead and use decals, and then off camera I'll come back and fill them in with a sprinkling of parked cars. So if you're really excited to see this parking lot full of cars for some reason, just keep your eyes out for that in the cinematics. Finally, I'm going to go through and just add the usual stain decals just to make it look nice and worn down, since I'm thinking that this garage would have been tacked on around the same time as one of these older extensions. So it's not going to be new and pristine like some of the other buildings around here. Obviously, it looks absolutely ridiculous to have this paper-thin piece of asphalt just floating in midair. So I'm going to take my cue from Duluth here and have the terrain beneath it be pretty steep and rocky. I'm going to plop down some concrete pillars beneath it and space them out at regular intervals. But that still leaves us with the problem of it being paper thin, so I'm going to use IMT on the main street below and add a network that has a fence coming out of a concrete barrier, and then I'm going to raise that up to the level of the parking deck, and that way we can have a barrier to make it look like it has some reinforcement and structure to it. Down below, I'm going to add those rocks I mentioned before, and a little bit of grass and a handful of trees as well, which might not make sense because this area doesn't get a lot of sun, but they have them in this spot in Duluth, and I think it looks kind of nice and really brings this place together. While I was working on the area around Main Street, I wanted to take care of the streetcar stops, which I moved underneath the main tower to give riders the easiest access to the main hospital building. I didn't want to add too much detail down here because I figured that we're not actually going to see it much, but just on the off chance that later on I choose to do a first-person streetcar ride video, I did want to have a few bits and bobs scattered around. So basically that just consists of a crosswalk so people can get from one stop to the other side of the building or vice versa, and some benches and a transit map for the stops themselves. The buildings that make up this older part of the extension on the other side of Main Street needed a little bit of adjustment since they didn't have any details on the back. So I'm going to take a copy of each building in PO, squish them down just until they're flat facades, and then clip them into the buildings facing the road. I like this kind of technique because it allows me to be a lot more flexible with the assets that I already have in my collection. So in this case, I can take a building that's meant to be wall to wall and it has this bare side to it and turn it into something that looks more modern and standalone. It is kind of annoying to do, so I only do it when it's really necessary, but it's just really helpful to be able to take my asset collection and expand its flexibility instead of having to quit out of the game, go to the workshop and spend an hour potentially to find that there's no asset that works exactly how I want it. But once I was done with that, it left me with a fairly broad sidewalk, and I just think that doesn't look very good. So instead of leaving it blank, I added a line of planters and lamps to brighten up the area. These planters look really nice, these little 3D kind of tree guard things, although it can be kind of hard to get the trees to line up with them because of the random tree rotation mod, which basically makes if the trunks aren't perfectly vertical, the trunks will spin around in addition to the rest of the tree, so you can't really get them quite centered all the time, but there's nothing I can really do about that. One thing I can do something about is this empty lot. In Duluth, they have this little lot sandwiched between the hospital and this standalone office on the other side. So I'm going to do something similar here next to this Art Deco office, which I had already placed down off camera. I love this asset. It looks so nice. I'm going to add a small parking lot and then surround it with this different cement texture prop, just to make this area stand out that little extra bit from the rest of the infrastructure. Then I'm going to add a smorgasbord of random utility props, which I have absolutely zero idea what most of them do. So I'm just going to fence off the ones that look like they might explode and then add some lines around it so people know not to park there, just in case the barbed wire fence and giant metal tank weren't enough of a warning. Since this lot would presumably be for the office building, at least the parking spaces, I wanted to use the same technique as before with PO to take this building, squish it down, and add a facade to this side, and then clip in a door prop to allow access from the lot. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, but it's more of a back entrance with a dumpster and a less impressive looking door. The lower elevation counterpart to that lot is going to be more or less a bit of a shot in the dark in terms of accuracy because it pretty much solely consists of these kind of utility looking things, which I have no idea about, and the elevation difference also makes it a bit of a problem. So I start by laying down a pavement road just to make sure everything is nice and level, but this keeps pulling down all the terrain conforming props on the upper level. Even when I try adding another terraforming road up top, it just doesn't work. So eventually I decide to pull the lower road forward a bit and then cover up this beautiful jagged terrain with a small extension to the upper part. This consists of a brick retaining wall and a nice dark asphalt fill that looks pretty new up top. Maybe that indicates that they have to remodel this area pretty frequently to keep up with utility upgrades or something like that. Although maybe that's not the case because the pipes I end up adding here look pretty worn and old. But oh well. Going back to the lower area, I'm just gonna let you watch me struggle to put this together. So I hope you enjoy that. Now with that part done, it pretty much takes us full circle around the modern part of the hospital with just this little grass strip remaining. I'm going to fill this up with grass and trees. Once again, I'm going for more mature ones since I'm thinking that this landscaping would have been here at least since the older extensions were built, maybe even before them. And they want to keep these in place to block noise coming from the freeway, at least in part. And the freeway isn't right there, but as I mentioned before, it's going to be pushed over basically right up against this road here, so I want to make sure they have a nice barrier in between the freeway and the hospital. Finally, to cap off this block, I'm just going to add one last entrance and a small desire path that's developed over the years. This block is already pretty well established as it is, and I didn't want to make it too interesting by adding a bunch of details, so I'm just going to go ahead and remove some of the built-in props from this in order to add my own back in, because why not? So that just involves a couple of planters, some benches, and some foliage, of course, to make this entrance a little more inviting than just this plain gray building, which is a nice looking asset, don't get me wrong, but it does need a little bit of green out front, I think, to make it fit into the context. After that, it's time to contend with the slope on this side, which is pretty harsh in this location. So I'm going to take another one of those useful office buildings that I was using before and clip it into the side to make an entrance that's more or less level with the road. Then I'm going to add some pavement along here and a white painted brick wall around it, just to make a nice, simple, level entrance without having to bother with making ramps or stairs or anything like that, because those are just kind of annoying to do on a slope like this. I'm going to do the same thing with the back of the building, taking another copy of this office building and clipping it at the level of the surface parking lot so people can access the building from there. And I think that gives a really nice effect. When you're working on a slope like this, having an entrance at the top of the slope and the bottom of the slope, I think can really sell it as a building that's been purpose-made for this environment, instead of taking something that's meant to be placed on a flat plane and forcing it onto a hill. Anyway, I plan on having the ambulances come out of the back of this part of the building, so I'm just going to add a nice little flat surface with this ploppable pavement. Garage door, a couple other props, stained decal, the usual stuff. And then I'm also going to take the building's spawn point, using this mod, and bring it around back so the ambulances will spawn here instead of just kind of popping into existence on the main road. The attached parking garage is going to get pretty much the same treatment, with yet another copy of this office building, providing access for the grand total of 2 people who have parked there. I was thinking at one point, maybe to go along with the recent renovations, they decided to make the block a little bit less gray by commissioning a mural on the side of the garage. If you got one of my Todo Santos live streams back in the day, that looks kind of cool actually. you're probably familiar with this wonderful asset, which I will link below in the description, along with my entire collection of mods and assets if you're looking for that. So if you leave a comment asking if I can share my asset collection, I'll know you didn't watch the entire video. So at this point, I thought we needed a name and a bit of branding to go with it. So in place of Duluth's version, which is St. Mary's Medical Center, I decided to go with the dollar store version, which is St. Gary's Medical Center. Let me know in the comments what Gary did to deserve being canonized. Since this fantastic building asset that I use is branded as Stowe's Hardware Company or something like that, obviously I need to cover that up and replace it with our custom branding. So I'm going to use this non-terrain conforming brick wall and add text to it in PO, just messing around with the X and Y scale sliders to compensate, because I had to reshape this asset to fit it to the building itself. So I just need to compensate a little bit so that the text doesn't look too squished. After copying that to each side of the sign, there's one more little spot that we need to replace the branding for. That is down at street level. This is actually in the perfect spot because it's facing all the oncoming traffic on this one-way street. So it just serves as a nice little welcome to the hospital area. I'm going to make the heating facility functional-ish by clipping in a couple of block services, including a power plant block, imagining that just like the downtown heating plant or the Canal Park heating plant, in the warmer months it can be redirected to generating electricity. I don't know if that's how these things actually work, but that's how it's going to work in this city. And then I'm also going to clip in a warehouse block storing oil so that we can get some vehicles coming and going from here. The little spot next to the building was a little difficult to deal with, so instead of trying to work with the slope here, I'm just going to level everything out at the level of the building, and then use this retaining wall with a fence attached to go in line with the sidewalk so you can get just a nice clean drop in between the two elevations. And then once we have the retaining walls and the terraforming roads put in there, it becomes a lot easier to deal with the slope because I can just use these vertical wall pieces instead of having to angle things with PO, which is always kind of annoying. So I'm just going to do it this way. So with the terrain dealt with, I just needed to throw down a few different details. I'm going to add some different surface decals to this little fenced-in area next to the chimney, just to make it stand out that little extra bit, alongside these utility props that I have no idea what they actually do or if they fit into this kind of area, but I think they look kind of cool here. The rest of the detailing along the avenue is going to be pretty bare bones and standard, but there is this extra depth in between the avenue and the building, so I'm going to use some grass props just to define the walkways and the sidewalk along here and give room for a little bit of landscaping as well. And I'm going to add a driveway for this entrance to the building, and then just detail around that as usual. Finally, to finish off the hospital, we have this service road. I'm kind of going out with a whimper, but I think that's okay. So this accesses the backs of all these buildings. It's a pretty awkward space. As you can see, you have the concrete bases of the newer buildings on the right, and there's just not a lot of space for vehicles to maneuver around. But I think that kind of makes sense with this kind of development, because the developers would want to dedicate as much space as possible to the buildings themselves and keep the road infrastructure to a bare minimum, so they can get the most out of this urban land, which is going to be quite expensive. So with that in mind, I'm going to add a garage at the far end, so if you needed to, you could have a truck back all the way down this alley right up to the door, and there you could load and unload stuff directly from the truck or into the truck. Other than that, it pretty much gets all the details you would expect out of an alley. So lots of trash and stains and other delicious alleyway things. While I'd been detailing the rest of the block, I was thinking of what to put down in this little rectangular pit over here. Instead of just having it be a little truck pulling or something, I decided to go with something more visual and relevant to the heating plant. And this is where they store some of the fuel, maybe it's backup fuel for the heating plant. And again, just like above, I'm going to use some different concrete decals just to make this spot stand out a little bit. Now, on top of the heating plant, I figured they would need like some various ventilation and stuff and ducts carrying all this warm air into the other buildings. So I'm just going to take these duct props and clip them into these two buildings to hook them up, which I think adds a nice little bit of detail to this. Just adds almost this kind of like greebly texture to the top and helps sell it a little bit, at least I hope, as the industrial part of the hospital, if you will. I'm going to do something similar over on the other side where it connects to the more modern building, except I'm going to use pipes instead of ducts just to switch it up a little bit. I thought it would be a shame to go ahead and record cinematics with this big ugly gap in between the hospital and downtown, so I wanted to quickly go ahead and fill in just a couple of blocks adjacent to Main Street. I'm thinking that there would be quite a bit of demand for commercial and residential created by the hospital, so I wanted to show that the area has undergone quite a bit of redevelopment, but it's not been totally gentrified and modernized. So we have a mix of new and old with more modern buildings like this mixed-use apartment building that has shops on the bottom floor. Great set of assets. And then there are some remnants of older architecture that hasn't been remodeled or replaced yet for whatever reason. Although you can see the sign of things to come with this empty block on the corner right across from the hospital, which still has a few remnants of whatever building used to stand here, but for whatever reason has not been developed into something new yet. This episode ended up being way longer than I anticipated, so I did the next couple of blocks off camera, starting with this more modern apartment building inspired by Duluth, which of course has its own off-street parking, which is a topic I plan on covering in more detail in a later episode. And then between the apartment and the hospital, I built another Duluth-inspired block, which has a church, which we're going to go ahead and call St. Gary's, and a couple of what I'm imagining are really old houses that are on some kind of historical register or something like that, so they haven't been torn down yet and had their land redeveloped, in contrast to their former neighbors whose houses were demolished at some point to make way for this satellite building for the hospital. Now that I'm looking at it, I'm not 100% satisfied with the way this build came out, especially the main tower, which is something I really struggled to get right. And there are a few details I missed, like after recording the cinematics, I realized that I totally forgot to add wayfinding signs around the campus, which I think would have been a nice detail. I'm definitely a little rusty since it's been a long time since I've played the game, but I hope you enjoyed the video anyway, and I hope it was worth the wait. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you on the next episode of Amaranth Bay.
Yeah.